February. Whoops. Okay, welcome to the Zoom talk for February. Olivia had put out an announcement just today that was slightly wrong. I don't know Adam. I've not heard him speak, but I did see that he was speaking to Maryland Hort, and it looked so good that I stole him. And luckily, I didn't have to go through the indignity of asking Maryland Hort. I have someone I can email up at Swarthmore, and they got me connected. So Adam, you come very, very well recommended. And with that, I'll leave it up to you.
All right, well, thank you for everybody joining us tonight. I'm excited to give this talk. It's been a little while since I've actually delivered this presentation. So yeah, I'm definitely excited to jump back into it. I wish it was in person, as we all do. It's much more interactive and fun to do it in person, but this is as good as we can get right now. So I appreciate everybody joining. So yeah, we'll jump right in. So just a quick outline for what I plan to talk to. We're gonna chat about why we grow roses sustainably, and kind of to get us an understanding of why we've gotten to this place where roses have kind of developed this poor reputation in the garden. I wanted to kind of jump back a little bit and talk about the evolution of the rose and why we are where we are in terms of their issues as good garden plants. And then also chatting about the things that we're doing in the rose garden to promote good health of the roses so that we can grow them organically and sustainably going into the future. So we'll chat about soil health and plant health, some pruning basics, selection, and some top performers that we have currently in the rose garden. All right. So as some of you know, the Deanbaum Rose Garden was originally created and designed in 1956. It was originally designed by Gertrude Wister, who was the assistant director of the Arboretum at the time. And the whole reason the garden came to be is because Robert Pyle of Conard Pyle Nursery was an alum of the college. And when he passed away, he left a pretty significant endowment to create a rose garden on campus. I've been told in the space where the rose garden currently exists, there's always been roses in that area. And he decided that he wanted to really enhance the garden and create a more enjoyable experience. So he left some money to have a rose garden in this space in perpetuity. So in 2012, when I started at the Arboretum, renovating the rose garden. Since the rose garden was planted in 1956, it had been maintained as a very standard rose garden. There were 7 beds, and they were all roses, nothing else in the rose garden. And at that time, the roses were getting sprayed about every 10 days to 2 weeks with different fungicides to primarily control black spot. So when I was approached and asked if I would take over the rose garden and the care and the redesign of it, I said, yes, that's great. I'd be happy to do so. But I have some thoughts about sustainability and ways that we can do it that will help preserve the garden in going into the future. And through conversations with different staff members and members of the college community, it was kind of decided that we would try to maintain the space completely organically. So that's the approach we've been going towards since about 2014 was our first year of full organic care in the rose garden. And that's the way it's been ever since. We've had a lot of growing pains and I've learned a lot. I'm not a rosarian by trade. I don't necessarily didn't necessarily enjoy roses prior to being approached with this project, but I've really grown to love and appreciate them in any garden setting. All right, so why would we grow roses sustainably? Well, there's many reasons, environmental reasons. It's, to me, it doesn't make sense to keep putting all of these synthetic inputs into a plant just to keep it looking good and healthy. If we can't have plants looking good and it just doesn't do anybody justice to keep pumping these roses full of fertilizer just so that we can get a few flowers and not really even have nice looking plants the rest of the year. So when you're taking an approach to this organic or sustainable rose garden, you've really got to buy into the complete system. There's no way that you can kind of dabble in some chemicals being applied in the rose garden, because it's really about creating a sustainable, vital system that eventually kind of takes care of itself. If you're going in with some chemicals here and there, it's really compromising the overall system and the concept of an organic approach, which I'll kind of jump into a little bit more as we get further into the presentation. So I mentioned kind of the history of roses. So initially, as roses evolved and roses that are natural in nature, species roses, they've developed resistance to different diseases and insects over time, or have been able to grow in harmony with the disease or with various insect issues that they've had. So if you really think about kind of regionally specific plants and things that do well in our region, in the Mid-Atlantic region, the native plants, they may have a few little disease issues, they may have a few little pest issues, but it's okay. It's not really harming them long term. So species roses were, the initial roses that are created by nature, and that's originally what people started hybridizing to get these different hybrids and variable roses. And not really concerned about pest and disease issues or even foliage. So here's just a few examples of some of the species roses that we have in the rose garden that the hybridizers and breeders started using to hybridize and breed roses way back when they first started hybridizing plants. So when they started doing hybridization, there's kind of these classes of roses that they've developed over time. So pre-1867 are considered heritage roses. So those are the roses that they hybridize using just species roses. And then after that point, when we started getting into more of the modern roses, what were known as modern roses, which were primarily developed and hybridized for the cut flower industry, that was, using species roses and heritage roses, pretty much anything they could get their hands on to develop that kind of quintessential beautiful cut rose on a long single stem with a high centered bud that lasts long in a vase. They weren't really concerned about garden worthiness at that point. So they were really basically breeding out all of those wonderful traits of the species roses that could handle some pest and disease issues. So fast forward several hundred years to kind of where we are now, where the sustainable and organic evolution started happening. People realized that they didn't want to grow roses because it just took so much input and so much chemicals and fertilizers to keep them looking good and flowering and having foliage year round. So many hybridizers, which we'll talk about a little bit later, really recognized this and started breeding roses that are considered new millennial roses that can be really great garden worthy plants. Hybridization coming out that give us all those wonderful traits of a beautiful classic rose, but have really good disease resistance. So here's just some examples of roses from heritage roses. So, early on, when you think of some of these hybridizations that were happening, they still had fragrance. They were really big, beautiful flowers, a lot of variation in color and flower form, as well as shrub growth habit. And then as we got further along into the modern rose, you can see these are the classifications that they were using um, to classify the more modern roses. So when we start talking about how we can grow these wonderful disease-resistant roses in the garden and how we can grow in an organic system, it all boils down to the soil health. And soil, I'm not a soil expert by any means, but I'm learning more and more as we go on about how dynamic soil really is and how vitally important it is for all of our garden plants, but specifically roses in general, because they produce so much growth every year. All they want to do is flower and produce beautiful seed pods and flowers all year round. So they require a pretty heavy amount of nutrition in the soil to support all of that growth. So when I start looking at the soil, these are the different things that I'm looking at. So soil tests are vitally, vitally important when you're starting, just to kind of get a basic, your nutrient levels. And one thing that most soil tests don't actually include is biological activity in the soil. And in most instances with your extension agents soil tests that you can get relatively easily, they don't necessarily include organic matter content unless you pay extra for it. So these are the basic building blocks that I look at in terms of soil health when I'm thinking of introducing roses into a new space. Now, one really amazing thing that they did do in the Dean Bond Rose Garden, where I work and maintain the rose garden, is every year they applied about 6 inches of either straight leaf compost or a 50-50 blend of wood chips and leaf compost. So that amount of organic matter every year added to the soil over, several decades really created a pretty beautiful soil structure for me to kind of inherit. So here's just kind of a glamour shot of the rose garden. This picture was from 3 years ago, I believe. So speaking of soil tests, when I took over the rose garden, initially there were 7 beds, and some of the beds were only 3 feet wide in some instances. And in that 3-foot span, in several cases, they had 5 to 7 roses crammed together within that space. So when I took over the garden and decided that we were going to renovate it and kind of reconfigure it a bit, we decided that we needed to expand some of the beds to accommodate the space that we. Result, we actually had to create beds in turf areas that had not been getting that amazing um, decades-long addition of organic material to the soil. So even still, the soil in this area of campus is really pretty. You can see the initial soil test that I had done, and I was looking into adding a bed in a new turf area. So it gives you a really good baseline to establish what you need to do to your soil in order to get it to the place where you need it to be for good nutrition for your roses. So roses like typically a slightly acidic soil. So you can see the pH was 6.9, so it's perfect for growing roses. And you can see most of the nutrient levels are at optimum or above optimum, which is lovely. So when I get one sort of this basic soil test from Penn State, it's to me it's a baseline. They always give you recommendations in terms of what you can do in terms of adding synthetic fertilizers to the soil to get it where you need it to be for growing roses. But I kind of take this with a grain of salt, and don't usually follow the recommendations. What I generally do is send off another soil test to the Soil Food Web in New York, and they test the soil for the biological activity. So healthy soil, healthy roses. So we really need to look at the biological activity in an organic system to have a healthy soil. If I'm putting down synthetic fertilizers, we're really destroying the natural process of decomposition of organic matter, as well as the entire ecosystem that lives within the soil strata. So as some of you may know, when we apply most synthetic fertilizers to the soil, they're salt-based. And salt is just as detrimental to the soil as it is to us if we're putting it on in our bodies in excess. So basically, when you're applying synthetic fertilizers that are salt-based year after year, you are destroying the natural ecosystem that lives within the soil strata where your roots are trying to establish and grow within the garden. So if you get a little bit more advanced in your knowledge of soil, you can actually do this at home with a microscope. You can dilute some of your soil in a water solution, and you can take a few drops of this and put it on a slide and look at it under a microscope. So here is a photo that I snagged from the internet of a very excellent sample of things that you want to see within your soil when you're looking at your soil structure. So you can see on the screen here, we've got some bacteria, we've got some minerals, we've got some protozoa, lots of organic matter, as well as some fungal hyphae that are in the soil. So this is a really, like I said, a really good balanced soil profile when you're looking at it under a microscope. And you want to see all these things, and you want to see kind of a balanced distribution of all of these things. If you see extremely high levels of bacteria, that's bad. If you see extremely high levels of fungi, it's not necessarily bad, but it's soil. So ideally, when you're starting fresh in an area that you're going to grow roses, I would send a soil sample off to Penn State to get your kind of baseline. And then I would also send a soil sample off to the Soil Food Web of New York, and they can give you a really good reading of what's in your soil and what else you can do organically to boost it up to help with soil structure and the natural decomposition of organic matter so that it can become available to your plants. Really, the whole system is based on decomposition of organic matter and having a cation exchange capacity so that organic matter and nutrients are available to your plants to be able to take up and grow happy and healthy. So just another picture of the rose garden. You can see all sorts of companion plants mixed in here. We did time the bloom of the roses with the salvia here that you see right in the middle of the screen. Purple is kind of a hard color to find in roses, so we thought it would just be a great way to highlight purple in the rose garden, as well as kind of unify the design. So because the garden is supposed to be a display of the best roses available to grow in the Atlantic region, we don't lay it out in large blocks of roses or blocks of color, or even think about color palette or color combinations. So as a result, we really wanted to have a way that we can unify the design and make it feel a little bit more cohesive, even though there's kind of this cacophony and cornucopia of mixed colors within the space. So when the roses are at their peak at the beginning of end of May, beginning of June, we timed it so that the salvia was blooming to kind of pull it all together and make it feel a little bit more cohesive. So I just wanted to kind of run down with you my preparation in terms of bed or when you're planting a single rose. So as I mentioned earlier, this is when in 2014, when we did some bed reconfiguration. This was the process that I went through in the fall to get in preparation for planting the following spring. So initially we laid out the bed edge, some spray paint and some flags, and then I put down 6 inches of really good quality compost. And we also did some analysis on the compost just to make sure that it had all of those lovely things that we just looked at in that picture previous, to make sure that we were introducing all of those things into the soil by adding the compost. So we added the 6 inches of compost and then we tilled it in. Now, tilling is kind of controversial. Some people think that tilling really ruins the soil structure, and I think in some instances it does if you over-till. But in this case, starting fresh in this new space, we did choose to till in the compost just because the bed was quite large. The other option would be to turn it in by hand. I'm not as young as I used to be, and I didn't feel up to the challenge of turning that all in by hand. And this is just one of the 4 beds that we reconfigured and went through this process with. So after it was all tilled in and the soil was looking nice and level and we got the bed edge established, I planted a cover crop. So that's the picture here on the left that you're seeing. Cover crop with a combination of buckwheat, winter wheat, crimson clover. Another reason that we did this is there's the phenomenon of rose root plant disease, and nobody really knows what causes it, but there seems to be this issue with roses where if you dig out a rose in one spot and then you plant a rose right back in that same spot, the new rose just seems to sit there and sit there and sit there and not grow and do well at all. So in an effort to kind of alleviate that situation, we really heavily amended the soil. We moved the beds in slightly different areas of the rose garden that hadn't been planted with roses before, to try and minimize that as much as possible. So another thing that we use quite a bit on campus when we're establishing plantings that need a little bit more nutrition is we add biochar. And biochar is basically charcoal. And if you're familiar with soil chemistry a little bit, carbon is really the binding element that holds nutrients in the soil. And if you think of charcoal in terms of, skincare or kind of cleaning and clarification, it's kind of like a big sponge. So it sucks up moisture, it sucks up nutrients, and holds on to organic matters and particles in the soil rather tightly so that it's not leaching out of the soil. And then it becomes available to plants as they come in contact with it. So we added about a ½ inch of biochar over the whole surface as well. So if you're just introducing one rose, you can basically do the same process in a small space. So here I am in an existing bed with my compost in the big red bucket. I've got my biochar in the bag in the center, and then on the right hand side of the screen is my initial fertilizer that I always add with a new rose just to give it a little bit of boost as it's getting started. And that's an organic based fertilizer. It's a 5:0:4 ratio, and it's basically composed of a bunch of different meals: soybean meal, alfalfa meal, bone meal. I'm trying to think what else is in there. just a lot of meals. There's all sorts of different ground up natural elements in there. And that's what we use as our fertilizer in the rose garden. And then the picture on the right is a close-up of the biochar that we add. So I just sprinkle a little bit of that in the hole, and I use my digging fork there on the right in the picture to really just incorporate it and mix it all around in the soil. So here's a close-up of the three products that I'm using and mentioned. On the left is the fertilizer. It's a wholesale company that we use in Lancaster, Pennsylvania that provides that for us. And in the center is the label of the biochar. And then on the far right is our fish hydrolysate. Fish hydrolysate has become a really, really important element for us in the rose garden. We use it as a foliar application for fertilizer. We also use it a lot for disease control. And it's an oil. It's a cold pressed oil. So there's no cooking involved in extracting the oils from the fish byproducts that they use to produce it. So it's familiar with fish emulsion, which is a very similar product. It's just produced in a different way. It's actually cooked. So the oils are a little less pure and a little bit more broken down than fish hydrolysate. So that's why I choose to use that over fish emulsion. This is well, two of the three products, the fertilizer and the fish hydrolysate. These are the wholesale formulations for them, but both of these products are available in garden centers and nurseries around in a retail package. So Nature's Neptune, which some of you have seen in garden centers, is the exact same product as the Nature's Essence fish hydrolysate. It's made in the same company and distributed by the same company. It's just packaged a little bit differently for the consumer. And if you're wondering where you can find out more information about these products, the links to websites are included in the handout. All right, some more glamour shots of the rose garden here. I'm very lucky. The rose garden's kind of in the heart of campus, and it's got some of the oldest and most beautiful buildings on campus as a backdrop. So the big building that you see here in the picture on the left is Parish Hall. And when the college was founded in 1864, that building housed the entire college. So dorms, classrooms, dining facilities, everything was in that building. We've grown a little bit since then, but it's really a lovely backdrop for the rose garden. All right, so thinking about plant health a little bit and things that we can do to kind of help with this organic system without really changing. Roses are susceptible to a lot of diseases: black spot, powdery mildew, botrytis, rust, downy mildew, on and on and on. But we can help with some of these issues just by properly spacing them. So making sure that we are providing enough air circulation specifically, as well as light penetration around the entire shrub to make sure that they're getting good exposure to both of those elements. Initially, when I took over the rose garden, it was basically a big thicket. You couldn't tell which rose was which, and it was just disease was running rampant as partially because of that. Proper pruning is really important, and we'll talk a little bit more about pruning later on. A lot of our pest issues that we have with roses, we can eliminate, well, I shouldn't say eliminate, minimize as much as possible by proper pruning. A lot of the insects that overwinter on roses actually overwinter in the tips and the buds. So if we're going in and doing pruning every year to help support good habit of the roses, we can actually help remove some of the pests that we have in the rose garden. So early detection of deficiencies and pest and disease issues is really important. So I've got a really wonderful group of volunteers that come in every other week to help me maintain the rose garden. But on the off weeks, me and my staff are in there on the off weeks, scouting and making sure everything's looking good. And as soon as we catch some things, we try and treat them as quickly as possible. That being said, we really have had very minimal pest and disease issues in the rose garden, um, primarily because of selection, but also I think it really has helped introducing other companion plants in biological activity happening in the rose garden. You know, if you think about a monoculture of crops, they're, you know, soybeans or corn or whatever it may be, they're constantly spraying it and putting inputs, because if they get an issue, it runs rampant very quickly. So by, you know, introducing companion plants, spreading things out a little bit, adding more diversity in the rose garden, it hasn't been nearly as catastrophic when small populations of pests move into the rose garden. So along with that, in an organic system, we can really encourage and even in some cases release beneficial insects into the garden to help us with that balance of good pests versus bad pests in the garden. And it's really been amazing to watch pollinators come back into the space and re-enliven the rose garden. When I took it over, it was pretty sterile, honestly. You would walk in and there was, you know, no bees buzzing around. Birds didn't really even want to be in there because there weren't any insects for them to eat to feed their young. But now, you know, we've got a resident catbird that nests every year and attacks me on occasion when I'm trying to work in the garden when she's got a clutch of eggs. You know, rabbits have moved back in, which is, you know, creates its own issues, but it's really lovely to see kind of the garden come back alive. So I wanted to talk a little bit about biostimulants versus fertilizers. So when we are traditionally thinking of fertilization or boosting plant health, that's really all that we're doing. We're not helping the soil by introducing salt-based fertilizers. We're not really helping the overall environment in terms of plant health. So really, we're trying not to treat, we're trying to create a system where biology is thriving. And by doing so, we're adding biostimulants instead of fertilizers. So a lot of organic companies are trying to coin the term of biostimulant versus fertilizer. It's kind of a hard mental switch for me to switch over to that phrase, but I'm definitely trying to be more active in educating people about stimulating the soil and not necessarily just trying to alleviate issues with the plant. Adequate moisture, like I mentioned earlier, roses are little hungry buggers, so they need a lot of fertility in the soil, but also adequate moisture, keeping the moisture nice and steady and even. And then of course, overhead watering, avoid that at all costs if possible. If you can't avoid overhead watering, I always recommend watering early in the day and on a sunny day so that the foliage can dry off and be dry before the evening. A lot of our fungal issues that we have thrive in kind of a humid, moist environment. So the drier we can keep the foliage, the better in terms of keeping pests and, or excuse me, diseases at bay. So just a couple pictures of a few of the pollinators that I've noticed coming back in. So we've got a nice carpenter bee on the left and a beautiful swallowtail butterfly on the right. And we definitely did not see any of that prior to this switch to an organic system and introducing companion plants. Another thing to think about is really giving pollinators and beneficial insects a boost in the spring. So we did start incorporating some very early blooming flowers and plants into the rose garden, specific, just really kind of pique their interest and say, hey guys, this is a place we want you to come and get to work early in the spring. So we did spend a little bit more time in terms of design combinations with the perennials and annuals and vines and some of the other shrubs that we introduced, just so that we can strengthen that design element in the rose garden as well. Oh, another thing to kind of point out and talk about in these two images is the image on the left with the tulips and the penstemon. In the bottom, that's an ornamental oregano. And that's also kind of in conjunction, and part of our IPM plan is to keep the rabbits and deer out. Even though it is in the middle of campus, we do have some deer that still wander in and nibble things from time to time. But we've incorporated a lot of herbs into the garden as well. So there's some oregano, some ornamental alliums, lavender as well. So we've spaced them around the garden so that rabbits and deer that don't really prefer very fragrant and stinky plants to chew on, they're less likely to come into them if they nibble on a few things that they find unpalatable. All right, so jumping into kind of pruning basics. So a lot of these new roses that we're introducing, I haven't grown before, and I'm not that familiar with in terms of how they want to grow. So generally, we get an idea from the description of the nursery how they think they're going to grow, but roses grow pretty different based on region and zone and weather. So the first year I plant them and I leave them alone. Less is more. I really like to watch how they're going to see what they're going to do and get familiar with the rose. This also gives it a chance to really put its energy into production. So primarily root production, but also top growth and foliage production. To me, a lot of times, even with my trees and shrubs, I leave them alone for the first year, first several years to kind of just get going a little bit before I do a lot of pruning. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways roses grow. And then, you can base your pruning program on that. Generally, I do a light pruning the second year, just after I've done some observations, depending on how the rose looks when it comes in. A lot of the new growth won't do a whole lot after that. So a lot of times I'll go in and clean up some of that older growth and remove some of that older growth as it's sending out new, more stronger and vibrant stems. Those are the ones that I want to preserve long term while I work and build on my structure. So one thing that's super important, and my volunteers actually get issued their own little sanitizing bottle when they come to the rose garden, is sanitizing your tools between each shrub at least. We've got over 250 roses in the rose garden. So between shrubs is what we do. A lot of people, if you have just a few roses at home, I would even recommend pruning between cuts as you're pruning your rose. You can actually transfer quite a few pathogens on your pruning implements from shrub to shrub. Yeah, so cane canker, to some extent powdery mildew and black spot can easily be transferred on your pruners from plant to plant if you're not sanitizing them. So some people will have like a Clorox wipe and they'll take a Clorox wipe and wipe things down between. We use simple rubbing alcohol diluted to about 70%, if not 50%, and we just give them a quick spray between each rose, and that definitely takes care of our sanitation efforts between shrubs when we prune. So these are a little bit hard to see, but going back to kind of that air circulation and light infiltration, it's really important that we are trying to create a structure in our roses that we can help both of those elements reach the center of the rose so that we're having good spacing. So a lot of times with really vigorous roses, I'll go through and do an initial pruning in January, just so that we're alleviating really long stems that are going to cross and rub and even potentially break in the winter winds. So ones that are vigorous, a lot of times I'll go in and I'll prune them about waist high in January, and then I'll let them sit until late February, mid-March. So we haven't started our pruning yet this year, just because I haven't had time yet. But now's the time when I really would encourage people to start getting into their rose garden and doing the proper pruning every year. So the buds are actually starting to swell, and that's the perfect time to go in and start these efforts, because you can see what is thriving and alive and what isn't. So you can see the image on the left is, I did my initial cut in January, and then this is kind of a finished product on the right. I'm really looking for a nicely spaced, even distribution of the canes, definitely thinning them out a little. Yeah, that's kind of the general concept as I'm going through and pruning. So I first look for anything that's dead, anything that's damaged or diseased, and then I take those out first. And quite a instances, that's usually enough. But if I've got a really vigorous rose that's doing quite well, I may have to thin it out by about a third to create this nice open structure. So here's kind of a top view, and I apologize, these are a little bit tough to see. I always say I want to take these pictures when it snows, after it snows, but the snow never sticks around long enough for me to be able to do that. So another thing I wanted to chat about briefly is winter versus summer pruning. So a lot of times when we talk about deadheading our roses, it gets a little bit misconstrued and a little bit misunderstood in the summer. So winter pruning is really to promote good structure and like I said, remove any dead, damaged, or diseased material. And I generally cut back anything that's smaller than a pencil in size, because it's really not large enough to support the weight of a rose, and it's just not going to throughout the growing season produce a good healthy structure of the plant. So summer pruning is a little bit different. It's to promote new growth for flower production. What you remove is what you're going to get. So the general rule of thumb that people usually go by when they're doing their deadheading or summer pruning is they go down to the first leaf that has 5 leaflets on it on the stem. So most of the times I would say it's, about 6 to 9 inches below the rose, the declining rose that you want to remove. If you think about it, it's smaller than a pencil usually, pretty significantly smaller than a pencil. And if you think about it's going to break and it's going to send out new growth from that point, which is going to have a flower bud on it. And if that flower bud is as large and as heavy as the initial one, it's not going to hold up well. It's going to flop, it's going to hang down, it's not going to have a nice presentation. And a lot of these roses will produce multiple flowers throughout the season. So if you're just cutting back to that very thin little stem, you're just going to keep repeating that instance where the rose isn't going to be able to hold itself up and it's going to kind of fall, flop, or break. So really, generally, what I recommend doing is going down 3 or 4 or 5 more leaf nodes below that first initial leaf of 5 leaflets, so that you're able to produce a large enough cane that can hold the weight of a newly produced rose, with in mind that it's going to be able to produce another flower or 2 on that same stem. It's a little bit hard to describe without visually showing you, but if anybody has follow-up questions at the end, I'd be happy to kind of follow up on that. So you can see a little bit in the picture here on the right-hand side, that I've removed pretty significant amount of growth in the summer to think about producing canes that are strong enough to produce nice flowers that stand upright. So generally speaking, I would say most of the length of stems that I'm removing in the summertime are 1.5 feet to 2 feet long. And it just depends on the rose. Some of our miniature roses and things of that nature that are a lot smaller in stature, this doesn't really apply, but this is for more of our large shrub hybrid teas, grandifloras, floribunda roses that produce longer canes in the summertime. So yeah, we just talked about that. So I'm not going to go into diseases too much in this talk because I know it's a big issue in our area, but if you're really selecting good hybridized roses that are disease resistant, they should be able to either outgrow disease or resist disease in general. If you do have some disease and pest issues that show up, I really challenge you to think about if it's really affecting the plant long term. So yes, if you have a rose that's completely defoliated from black spot midsummer, I would consider using something to help that rose reflush and send out new leaves. Or I would even further challenge you to say, maybe this isn't the right rose for my garden. Maybe I should try something different. And if you do a quick internet search, if you're having some disease issues, there's lots of resources about natural disease products that you can use to alleviate some of the disease. But along those lines, the fish hydrolysate that I mentioned earlier, that's primarily what we use in the rose garden as our disease control. So it is an oil, and the oil actually creates a little bit of a slippery surface on all of the leaves. So we generally go in about every 2 to 3 weeks and we do hydrolysate. So it's not only helping do a foliar fertilization of the roses, it's also creating a little bit of an oily surface on the leaf, which most of our fungal pathogens are dispersed by spores. The spores just don't have an option to land on the leaf. They just kind of fall off and fall to the ground. And we found that it's been really, really successful in the rose garden. But the one disease that I did want to talk about specifically is rose rosette. I'm turning quite gray in the last few years, and I like to tease at work that it's because of rose rosette. So up until about 4 years ago, rose rosette had not made an appearance in the rose garden, but now it has. And unfortunately, over the last 3 years, we've had to remove, I think the 1 year we removed over 50 roses, and last year we removed about 30 roses that had succumbed to rose rosette disease. So it is a virus that's transmitted by an eriophyte mite that blows in the wind. The little mite blows in the wind, and if it lands on one of your roses and starts feeding on your rose, it's going to infect your rose. And you can see by the photograph, that's primarily the main sign that you see if your rose is infected with rose rosette. It's generally on new growth. New canes come out, and you can see the inner nodes are a little shorter. It's very abundant with prickles or thorns. The foliage is usually kind of crinkled and deformed, and generally it has this very red appearance. Some people believe that if you catch it early and you prune those affected canes all the way to the base, that you can either slow down or eliminate the. Tried it for a couple of years, and the roses that I've tried that with in future years have always had rose rosette the following year. So we've kind of developed a hard policy against rose rosette, and that as soon as we see it, the rose comes out. We try and get as much of the root system out as possible. And then we let that space sit vacant for at least one growing season, just so that those roots have the ability to break down in the soil. There hasn't been any evidence that root grafting can transmit the virus, but with other viruses, it has been proven. So we've just taken the fast and hard rule to remove them. Unfortunately, because it is a virus, there's no treatment that we can do to this to help them get through this. And again, like I said, we leave the space empty for about a year, which helps with rose replant. But we also hope that it helps break down some of those roots so that we're not possibly transmitting the virus through root grafting. All right, let's see what's next. So purchasing roses. So with a lot of these newly introduced disease-resistant roses that they've been hybridizing, lots of people want them, and the fastest way to get them out onto the market is to graft them. So basically taking a cutting of the desirable rose and grafting it onto rootstock. It's fast, it's easy to transport a grafted rose. But generally speaking, I highly prefer roses that have been developed on their own root. So taking a cutting, rooting that cutting, allowing it to grow on for a few years, and then making it available to purchase. It's much slower in terms of a nursery production, but it's a much more successful plant, in my opinion. The root systems are much more highly developed. They're much more fibrous root system. There's no worry about graft failure long term. So in general, I really try and get roses that have been grown on their own roots. So here's a picture, a couple pictures of roses that have been grown on their own roots. So these were grown from cuttings, and you can see the roots are very fibrous. There's lots of roots, just really nice plants that have been provided by the nurserymen. And the next image here is grafted plants. So you can see their root systems are much more woody. There's not as much fibrous root system. So it takes them a little bit longer to develop a root system that's really healthy and active. Yeah. But unfortunately, there aren't a lot of producers that grow roses on their own roots. Grafted roses are by far the more popular way for nurserymen to produce roses quickly and get them out into the trade as fast as possible. So when I get new roses in, I always take off all of the soil. I don't want anything introduced into the. So in both cases, if they're on their own roots or if they're grafted, I take all the soil off, and then I generally soak them overnight in a mixture of water, fish hydrolysate. I usually add a little kelp extract in there as well, just to kind of inoculate them with some of the good bits that we want them to have when they're planted in the garden. And it just really helps them fully hydrate before we plant them as well. So another thing to think about with the grafted roses is the rootstock itself. A lot of times they're grafted onto multiflora rose, which we all know is super invasive, but it's also a very hardy rose. So that's why they choose it as the rootstock. So when you're planting the grafted roses, you really want to make sure that you're planting them about 2 to 3 inches at least deep. So you want to bury that rootstock at least 2 to 3 inches deep so that eventually over time, the rootstock doesn't have a chance to sprout and grow and kind of overtake the desirable rose that you have planted. Another lovely image. All right, so in terms of selection, these are some of the hybridizers that have been hybridizing really good disease, what I call garden-worthy roses for quite some time. So the Cortis family is a German family, and they've been hybridizing garden-worthy disease-resistant roses for many decades now. And generally speaking, for Mid-Atlantic region, which Swarthmore and the Scott Arboretum is located, their hybrid hybrids are doing really, really well for us. They have a similar climate in Germany as to what we have here in when I'm looking to introduce new roses, I start with the Cortist hybrids. That being said, there are several other hybridizers and breeders that are really coming into their own as well. So Meliand is a French company. They've been focusing on disease-resistant roses as well as Ping Lim, who is just a hobby hybridizer who's turned into a super hybridizer that everybody's trying to get roses from. His roses have been extremely successful for me in the rose garden, and I'm really looking forward to more introductions from him. So Radler roses, which most of you would be familiar with as kind of the knockout series of roses. He's from Wisconsin, my home state, and he's, branching out from the knockouts as well and really developing a lot of really amazing roses, garden worthy, different forms, shapes, sizes, colors, and even fragrances of disease resistant roses. So kind of as a side note, one interesting thing that when hybridizers started developing these disease resistant roses, it was interesting that the first trait that seemed to disappear from the rose when they were getting disease resistance was fragrance. So everybody loves fragrance on a rose. I certainly do. It's part of the reason why we grow roses to begin with. But now that they've got a really good baseline of disease resistance, they're really trying to introduce some of more of those desirable traits of the old world roses that we have, primarily fragrance and different flower forms. So it's getting more and more exciting every year to see the different forms and fragrances that are coming out in these amazing disease resistant roses. Or new roses to introduce into your garden under this organic or sustainable system, this is a really good place to start. So there's two trials that have been going on for many years now. The Earth Kind Rose Trials, which was started by Texas A&M, has been going on for many years now, and it's all about disease-resistant roses for the landscape. So they've got a lovely website, which is included in the handout, that you can go and look at roses that they recommend. And then the American Rose Trials for Sustainability, which on campus we've been participating in for the last 5 years now. It's a newer trial system, and they're primarily trialing either new introductions onto the market or roses that have not even been introduced yet for their garden worthiness and disease resistance. So they've got a really lovely website as well that you can reference in terms of their trials. And the picture on the right is a photo from our rose trial that we have on campus. It's not accessible to the public, but if anybody would like to see it, I'd be happy to show you. So with all these new hybrids and the variability of roses, when I was researching and learning about this system, New York Botanic Garden also has a really lovely rose garden that's maintained organically. So I was consulting with them quite a bit about selection and just their overall system. So I made many visits up there throughout the year to check out how their roses were doing and all the different introductions they have placed in the garden. And we tried several of the roses that they had in their garden. And even just the 100 miles difference between New York Botanic Garden and the Scott Arboretum, there's a pretty significant difference in terms of humidity. So we would try roses in our garden and they would just do terribly. Some of the best producers and best looking roses in New York would do terrible for us just because of a little bit more humidity down where we are in Pennsylvania. So we really have to do some time evaluating and looking at these roses every year, even with the best and brightest disease-resistant roses may not do great for you in your garden based on your weather conditions. So when we introduce a new rose into the garden, I give it 2 or 3 years to kind of get settled in and see how it's going to do. And every fall I go through and I evaluate the entire collection. So these are 2 pictures of roses in the fall, and this is exactly what we're looking for. So this is Scarlet Bonica on the left, and then on the right is Flower Carpet Pink Supreme. So not a ton of flowers, which is fine for the fall season, but you can see there's not a spot of black spot on either of them. They've retained their foliage from top to bottom. They're looking really green, lush, and full. So this is really what we're looking for when we're evaluating the roses in fall. Conversely, this is what we do not want. So you can see these roses here were completely succumb to black spot. They're completely defoliated. So these will promptly be removed and we will try something new in that space. All right, so we're at an hour and I definitely want to leave time for some questions. These are some of the top performers that we've had in the Rose Garden. And the really lovely thing about the Scott Arboretum website is that we have a feature on there called Arboretum Navigator. And it's a search option. So if you click on Arboretum Navigator and then click on do plant search, up pops a search engine and you can type in any plant name. So you can type in rose and hit enter and every single rose that we have on campus will pop up. So if you're interested in seeing what we have in the rose garden and different varieties that we're growing, that's a great way to be able to access all of that information. So I'm going to flip through these kind of quickly. These are some of the roses that we have currently in the rose garden that are doing really well. And I would recommend for the Mid-Atlantic region. So Rosa rubiginosa, it's a monster. It can get to be 15 feet tall, 15 feet wide. It's a species rose, so it only blooms once a season. It's got this nice 5-petal flower, which is typical of most species roses. But 2 really outstanding characteristics of this rose is that it produces an abundance of really beautiful hips that persist all winter. And the foliage is actually the fragrant part of this rose, and it has a very kind of green apple spicy fragrance that you can smell several yards away when you're approaching the rose. Rosa glauca, another species rose. It's not native, but it's a really beautiful rose for 4 seasons. It produces nice hips, again, a nice clear pink 5-petal flower. But the foliage is really what I love, this nice kind of blue-gray foliage with red highlights to the stems. Harrison's yellow is one of the very first roses to bloom in the rose garden. These really beautiful, clear yellow flowers. This is, like I said, one of the first ones. It's kind of waking up with the rose garden. When this is blooming, we know the season is happening and it's going to look amazing for the next several weeks. A little bit smaller. This one's about 2.5 feet tall. The flowers on this spinosissima are just electric magenta. You notice it from 100 yards away. It's just really, really beautiful. And the nice thing about the spinosissimas is they produce small hips, but they're black. They're deep, deep, deep red to almost black hips that are really lovely. If you want fragrance, definitely grow the rugosa roses. Just amazing for fragrance. One thing you do have to watch out for with a lot of our species roses is a cane borer. So a lot of the species roses get this cane borer, which is actually a native insect. So if you love our native insects, you wouldn't be too upset about finding this in your rose garden, but it basically kills the entire cane. So late in the season in August, if you start seeing entire canes turn brown, basically overnight. If you follow those canes down back to a certain point, you'll see this swollen spot on the cane, and that's where the little larva has gone in there and kind of burrowed around and basically girdled the stem of the rose. So basically all you need to do is trim it out and just hope next season it recovers. Beverly, if I had to grow one hybrid tea, extremely disease resistant, just a really lovely hybrid tea rose. And if you can see in the photograph on the right, the foliage is really thick and leathery and glossy. A lot of the really good disease resistant roses have this really thick, almost leathery type of leaf. Summer Sun, this is another lovely Floribunda. Again, really nice glossy leathery foliage, lovely flowers, kind of an unusual color. One of my favorite shrub roses is Postilion. The buds are kind of this saffron color, and then as they open, they mature to this really beautiful yellow, very large shrub rose, very sturdy. Garden Delight. This rose is the rose that I probably get most comments on when visitors are in the garden. They, a lot of times they think it's two roses that we've kind of interplanted in one spot because there's just so many different colors as the flowers and buds are produced and grow and age. Another lovely kind of more small front of the border rose, Solero. One thing that I did want to mention is a series of roses. So the Home Run series is a series by Weeks Roses. And generally speaking, this series is extremely disease resistant. So the Knockout Rose has been known as kind of the industry standard for disease resistance. The Home Run series, which this is the original plant from the series Home Run, I would say they almost have better disease resistance than the Knockout series. Kind of utilitarian in their which is similar of the Knockout Rose, but wow, I've never seen a single spot of black spot on it in the many years that I've grown it in the rose garden. And they are starting to come out with the different options within this line. So there's a Home Run Pink, there's Home Run Watercolors now, which both of those just came out onto the market within the last year or two. If you had to grow one climbing rose, if I had to grow one climbing rose, this would be it, Golden Gate. Extremely disease resistant, beautiful, beautiful yellow flowers. It's easy to grow as a climber. The canes are really long and kind of willowy, so you can manipulate it well. And this one produces huge, huge bright orange hips. I would say almost $half size hips that persist well into the winter. Okay, so I mentioned Arboretum Navigator earlier. This is an image of the website. So you can see kind of in the center screen to the left, you would highlight Find a Plant. And you'd click on that. And then it would take you to a search bar and you would just type in rose and it'll pull up every single rose that we have in the rose garden. So you can see exactly what we're trying and what we're growing in the rose garden. And this is updated almost daily. So if we remove something, if it's there one day and it's gone the next, you'll know that it wasn't a good rose in the rose garden. And that holds true of any plant on campus. So if you want to know what quercus we have on campus, you just type in oak and all of the oaks will pop up. It's a really, really great feature. So the roses that I just highlighted and the roses that are on the handout are kind of roses that are easier to find in the trade. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and learn more about the different roses that we have in the rose garden that are a little bit more unusual. I would suggest using the Arboretum Navigator, and then you can kind of peruse that for some different ideas for more unusual varieties. So there is a handout that will be, if it hasn't already been shared with you. And it includes, again, kind of some more of the bread and butter top performers that we have in the Dean Bond Rose Garden that are relatively easy to source. And then there's links for some useful information. So information about the soil food web, testing, as well as some information about the fertilizer companies and product companies that we use, and then recommended readings, and then also some sources for roses that I use frequently. Now don't go don't go buying everybody out. So I don't have any options, but there are some really great resources online for really good disease-resistant roses. And most of them are mail order, so it's great to have all of those. All right, I talked for a long time. So I guess I can look at the chat and see if we have any questions. I think everybody was muted, but I mean, I would be okay if they were unmuted, and if anybody wanted to shout out questions, I'd be cool with that too. Oh, somebody asked what about specifically companion plants. Let's see. So initially when we did companion plants that would attract certain beneficial insects at a certain time of year. So I mentioned the Salvia caridana. That's a companion plant that we use more as a design feature. We introduced an annual early in the season alyssum. So that's known for really attracting beneficial insects and pollinators early in the season. So that's a companion plant that we use pretty frequently. Monarda is in there. We've got ornamental oregano, ornamental allium, the bulb, as well as allium summer beauty, which is more of a late bloomer kind of perennial type. Lavender, lavender phenomenal we use as kind of a mid-season bridge for color when the rose garden's gone a little bit quiet. Viburnums, we actually have several viburnums in there as an early pollinator attractant. Lilies, our Asiatic lilies, we use those midsummer to add some pop of color in midsummer. So yeah, that's a smattering of some of the companion plants that we use.
Thank you.
Oh, there was a comment in the chat that I wanted to talk about. So it's a little bit of a misconception that the knockout rose is more susceptible to rose rosette than other roses. And the reason I think that that's a common belief is that there's knockouts everywhere. See it on some of their other roses. Currently, there hasn't really been any hard science stating that there are roses that are resistant to rose rosette disease. Basically, any rose is susceptible to it. But like I said, knockouts just seem to get a bad rap because we see them so often. And yeah, they're not any more susceptible to rose rosette than any other rose. What month do I plant my roses? It's mostly dictated by availability. So most of the mail order sources that I'm getting roses from have availability in the fall and then again early in the spring. I prefer planting in the fall if I had a choice. And generally speaking, fall plantings seem to establish a little bit better for me. So yeah, usually October is when I'm planting in the fall, and then the spring I like to have everything planted in the ground before the second week of May. Yes, a really good comment about biochar, that it's a good sequestration tool for carbon dioxide as well. Actually, some municipalities are requiring it to be put under sidewalks as CO2 sequestration. Ah, great question. Does fish hydrolysate deter Japanese beetles at all? I think it does. The fish hydrolysate definitely is a little bit stinky when you apply it, but as soon as it dries, you don't smell it anymore, and it doesn't. The smell doesn't refresh with rain. Deters the Japanese beetles. You know, like I said, it just has that oily coating on the surface that I don't think a lot of chewing insects like. Another trick for Japanese beetles, if anybody has a major issue with them, Persicaria. I have a couple of Persicaria that I've tucked in the rose garden in inconspicuous places. Japanese beetle love it. It's like candy to them. So I plant a couple of those as kind of sacrificial lambs for the Japanese beetle to go to. And basically they defoliate that plant. And it's also a place where they gather and I can go in and hand remove Japanese beetles. Another really good question about own root roses. The question was, they're generally very small, 4-inch pots or even smaller. Are there any mail order sources for larger ones? I have not found any that offer larger on-route roses, but if any of you do, please let me know because I would love to have a source that has grown them on for a few more years. One really good source that I've been using a lot lately is High Country Roses in Colorado. They grow their roses on their own roots, but yes, they are very, very tiny when they come. So it takes them quite a while to get going. Yeah, somebody asked about transplanting roses in the winter and if it was okay. Yes, as long as you can dig and move roses, or as long as you can get in the soil and dig, it's okay to move them. They're generally pretty tough when it comes to transplanting. I would just make sure that you're not overwatering. Initially, give them a good soak when you move them, but let them kind of be quiet in terms of watering your inputs until they start growing and pushing some new growth later in the season. Yeah, we're transplanting perennials and shrubs around at the Arboretum currently because the soil hasn't really frozen over. All right, I think that was all the questions that came up in the chat. Does anybody have anything else they would like to ask or chat about? All right. Um, well, I would just like to thank everybody for joining me tonight. It was really great to see all the participants and the interest in growing roses sustainably. I'd just like to say I'm not an expert by any means on roses, but I think I provided some really good resources um, for you to be able to kind of dig in a little bit deeper um, into growing roses sustainably. And there's a really, really good book in the recommended readings by Peter Kukielski, who used to be the curator of the Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden at New York Botanic Garden. And that's really where I kind of started my education process with growing the roses sustainably. Yes, I do have an email address, which I'd be happy to share with you. I'm going to put it in the chat right now. Yeah, by all means, if any of you have follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I try and answer emails within a day or two, but with spring season coming up, we're quite busy at the Arboretum, so I'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible.
Adam, this has been an incredible talk. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us this evening.
You're very, very welcome. Yeah, everybody have a great night and happy spring. Happy planting.
Thanks, Adam. It was great.
You're welcome.